Hello and welcome to another edition of the Low Code Cafe. This is episode number 139 for June 28, 2023. Today we're going to be talking about mastering session storage in Plantain App, show some strategies and techniques. And then this is part one of a two-part series. We'll show some advanced techniques in our next session 2 weeks from now. So today we'll be talking about session storage in the hands-on low coding part. But we'll also talk about hotfixes and other things. Before we go on, let me introduce myself. I am Dale Warner. I'm head of support for Plantain App. And also on the webinar today, Patrick Anderson, who is a technical success manager for Plantain App. So we're glad you're spending the next hour or so with us. This is an event we hold every 2 weeks on Wednesdays at 10 a.m. Central Time, and we present updates and demos and hands-on coding, and also some stories and tips from our team in the community. You're welcome to be our guest speaker. Reach out and talk to us. Some of our most successful episodes have been with guest speakers. All of our past episodes, all 138 of them, are out on youtube.com/plantainapp, so you can use that QR code to get into them. Lots and lots of good training content there, and you have the ability to search within YouTube to find a topic of interest to you. So hopefully that will those will help you. Today we'll be doing some hands-on, we'll do a from the trenches segment. I have these out of order. From the trenches of support, I'll explain some things that are going on in support, and then we'll get right on into hands-on low-code development. Do interact with us. There's a chat window or a question and answer window. You can raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and after it's all over, there's a feedback form. We'll put those links out on the chat for you to get access to. As I mentioned, this is presented bi-weekly, and so the next event will be held on July 12th. Good. So from the trenches of support, first we'll talk about hotfixes. Our current Plantain App version is version 1.25. We've previously released 18 different hotfixes, and there's 2 more that have gone out in this last 2 weeks. One is with our form builder. So this was something that was reported by a user where when you do a form and have many different types of fields on the form, that when fields are required to be filled in, sometimes certain fields wouldn't be revealed as required until other required fields were filled in, and kind of provided an inconsistent user experience. And so we've made a change to that to try to make them where they all show up as required at the same time. We had another issue reported by a user in our automation section. There's the ability to, you have triggers that start off jobs, and there was not the ability to disable a trigger. It's there visually, but it wasn't actually disabling the trigger. So that was a fix, an oversight that we got corrected. As far as other things to mention in our from the trenches segment, I don't have a slide for it, but I mentioned in one of our other webinars, the Low Code Campfire, that goes on Fridays this same hour. I mentioned last week that we had a breaking change in version 1.25, meaning that there were issues with one of our features called custom validators. It's the ability in forms to be able to validate data, whether it conforms to a specific format like zip code or telephone or things like that. You can set up your own validators, and we converted those from XML to JSON. So if you happen to use custom validators, please reach out to us or view that last episode in Low Code Campfire from last Friday. Great. So Campfire is a meeting format event that we do every week, and it's an opportunity to come together and talk about the experiences that you're having within Plantain App. And oftentimes this serves as a virtual IT committee where you can have an issue or a question, and we get together and either solve the issue or maybe suggest a course of action. So it's a very valuable, especially to those of you who are working virtually. It's an opportunity to come together and meet with fellow enthusiasts and users of the product. So Low Code Campfire, watch for emails about that. And Patrick has been kind enough to paste all the links on the webinar chat, so you can see those to register in advance for Campfire, how to get to our YouTube recordings. There's also a link there for our community portal, which is another great place to get questions answered. Community and our support staff monitor those, and so you can post there about something that you're encountering and perhaps get an answer. And then you can give feedback on this webinar. That's the last link on that list, so do check out those. Great, so we have saved most of our hour for some hands-on low coding. Today we're going to talk about session storage, what it is, why it's important, and the tools that are available within the product to make that easy to work with. So I did a little research on the internet trying to explain, this is an important topic, but trying to explain it exactly what it is. And this is a pretty good definition. When you're dealing with web application development, there is this concept of how, as you're navigating from page to page, how do you preserve the state of how you're interacting with the user between web pages? Because, as you probably know, when you browse to a web page, you interact with the server, and then after you get to that page, however you interact with it is usually not being communicated to the server. You're filling in a form, or looking at a listing, switching from tab to tab, and there's no communication going on with the server at that point. So the low code development that you're doing doesn't really know what the context is. So when you hit a button and it does a communication back to the website, now the program goes back into action, and the question is, what is it acting on? How does it know if you are working with an order? How do you know that you're trying to drill down and find the line items of that order? So session state is all about trying to figure out, trying to communicate and keep up with the information so that the application can interact with the user in wherever they are in the process of interacting with your application. So hopefully that'll become a little bit more clear. There are, as we go along, there are several different ways to do it. I don't know that this is all of them, but these are the ones that we provide easy access to within our application. And so, and I'm going to be digging into all of this big long grid here as we do the next segment. So these 5 types that are listed down the left, we'll explore each of these, but you can pass session information along on the query string or the URL of the browser. There is a tool called Session that you can put information into. You can use the cookies of the browser to keep information. There is within our platform, the platform that underlies Plantain app, there is a concept called profile, and so you can interact with the profile, and then you can kind of do your own thing by using entities. And I guarantee you there are others that we haven't covered and may be of use as well, but these are the common ones. So within that, each of these have different properties. There's some way to create some session state, some way to retrieve it when you're on the next page or the next web page that you're going to. There's a different durability. How long does that piece of information last? Whether or not it's visible and accessible to the user, whether or not it can be modified by the user, whether there's support for it when your user is not logged in, which would be unauthenticated user. So before they log in or after they log out, do you still have access to that thing? And so with all those combination of things, there's a place where that particular method of maintaining session, it's good for things, and then there's concerns of it. And so we're going to explore all of these one by one. Start with query string. So with that, I'm going to do hands-on low coding. So this same graph, same chart that I was showing you a moment ago, I've got it here, and this is the one we'll actually be exploring, and we're going to start with query string. So I have a test site that is pretty much empty. It's just got our home page and a configuration page. I'm going to add a couple of pages just to illustrate why we need session. So within Plant an App, there's a pages. I'm going to add a new page. The first one is called Input. I'm going to give it the same title. So we're going to input something on this. We're going to make this accessible to everyone, whether or not they're on this, logged in. And then I'm going to make it where our developer roles can edit the page. So that's the first page. And then we're going to have another page called Display. And in the same way, we'll make it available to all users and editable by our developer roles. So that's pretty much, that's the start of setup anyway. So when we refresh now, we have these. We should have, but I missed a step. Patrick is probably screaming into his muted microphone that I didn't make them public and I wanted to. So we'll edit them and fix that. So visible in the menu, yes. Save. In the same way, the display page will make it visible in the menu. Easy change. So now we have our input page, our display page. And so the general scope of what we're going to do is I'm going to build a form here that represents how we're interacting with the user. The user is going to fill in a very simple form. And then when they click, we'll navigate them to the display form and still have that information available to us to use. So it's going to illustrate these different concepts of durability and usefulness of the different items. So with all of this work, I'm going to do it in the context of a form. I'm going to create a form, and so we'll add that to the page. And the form itself is going to be a blank form. And we're going to start out just by saying that it is the input form. We like to give things names. And I'm going to do a static text field to say this is input. And so with that simple bit of setup, we now have a input form available to us, and we'll be modifying that. When it we'll also be using a form on the display page to illustrate that we're able to retrieve this information. So for that as well. So we're going to call that the display form. And in the same way, we'll just add a nice static text here that says that this is the display form, just so we can keep track of where we are. Setup is complete, and we can dive into the meat of the thing. Of course, I made a misspelling, but that's okay. We need that's something we can fix. So when I'm working with forms, I like to use this manage button. And while you can use the manage form and full screen mode is what I like to use, but if you right click and say that you want this in a new tab, that gives us access to it kind of on a perpetual basis. We can just quickly make modifications. And so correct my spelling error and save the change. And now when we go back here and refresh, we can see the display form is corrected. To save time, I'm going to do the same thing on the input form. Oops. So we'll open the input page and modify the input form. So we'll say manage that in a new tab. And so now we have these two things, and I'm going to rearrange it so it's very easy to see. We have the input form and the display form ready to go. Good. So that's step one setup. We haven't done a thing yet, but put some nice graphics on the screen. So going back to what we were trying to accomplish, we want to illustrate how we can use query string to pass session state information around. And so what this means is to create it, typically it's done on a redirect action. So you're going to collect some information on your form, and then when you redirect to another page, in our case, the display page, we'll put it on the query string so it's available to that other page to look at. Let's see how that works. We're going to have a field, going to add a text field called name. And I'm going to change our setup a little bit. Just to keep things nice. I like my labels on the top. So that little bit there, if I refresh and get a look at it, we have a name field now. So we're going to fill in a name. I'm going to add a button as well. And when we click the button, it's going to go from the input page to the display page. So let's get that done. That is done by the add button. And so what we're going to do, this is going to be a page called, a button called test query string. We're going to put a bunch of different kinds, each of the 5 different ones, we're going to put them all in the same page. And so we're going to differentiate these buttons and what they do by the title that we put on it. So we're testing out the query string functionality. And so what we want to happen when we click the button is we're going to redirect to a different page. There, we're going to go to the display page, and so we'll find our display page here in the list. So when they click the button, it's going to go to the display page, and then we're going to pass along the name on the query string. So we can just say name equals, and then so this is a literal that will appear in the query string, and then our query string, the identity of this field is called test query string. So we want this value to go on the query string, and so we say name equals, and then put it in brackets test query string. So when this passes along, it'll pass along on the query string. I am, for consistency's sake, I'm going to not use the URL provider. That just means that the format of the way the URL is built is a little simpler here. So I'm going to choose that option. So let's see what we get. We come back to our input page, we refresh, and now we can, it has a place to put our name. We'll put a name and hit this test query string button. You'll see that we get redirected to the display name. It didn't pass the name as I would expect. So as usual, I've made some kind of a mistake. Let's look and see what I did. The name of this button is called test query string, but the field I actually wanted to pass was called name. So we're going to take, this is the ID that I really wanted to pass. So rookie mistake. So we go to our button. And yeah, we want to pass the name field. Great. So there's the developer experience. Do it and then test it. So when we type in the name and hit this, it redirects, and then now name equals Matthew appears here. So it's on the query string, and this is something that we can consume. And one way to do that, and we'll go to the definition of our display form and add a field, and we will do it as a text box. The point is, we want to be able to consume this, use it on the next page. It's been passed along to us. And so this is going to be called our query string name. We just want to differentiate these as we go along. And it's going to get its initial value from a special token. And I guess we should talk about that. So we created it by the redirect action, but we're going to use the get token to retrieve it. We can see what the get token should look like by going to tokens and looking it up. So there is you say get and the name of a key, and that will retrieve that value. So in our display form, we're going to set the initial value of our field to get name. So this essentially is saying get the value off of the query string and make it be the initial value of query string name. So let's see how that works out. We save it. And so now we can refresh our form. And because name equals Matthew up here, the query string name has the value of Matthew. So we have wired it successfully. We can use information that was developed on one screen, on the next in another form, or within a listing, or in many different ways, but we successfully passed it from page to page. So going back to our matrix to kind of discuss what we did, we created it this way, we retrieved it this way. And what is the durability? Well, this lives in the URL. If the URL doesn't have name equal whatever, then it's gone. So it's very short term. It's connected to having it in the URL. The next thing, is it visible and accessible? So the point is, you're looking at this and you can see it. And so depending on what you're designing, you may or may not want something to be visible to the user. And if you don't want it to be visible, then query string might not be the choice for you. Well, it's not, because it is visible. The next thing is, can it be modified? And the answer is yes. If we go to our page and we have name equals Matthew, and we change it to Mark, simply by changing it here and letting the form refresh, now it's pulling this, doing what it's supposed to do. It's pulling the value of name, putting it in a query string. So it's changeable. And this might be a behavior that you really like, but it might be one that's that you don't, that it's a security implication. So you take one case where you want to be able to allow a user to build a URL to look at an order in your system, and it's okay if they do that. So they can just type in an order number in their value in the query string in the URL, and they get there. But in another case, you might not want to let them change it. You might not want to let them select their own order. Then they might be browsing to an order that they don't and shouldn't have access to. So that can be a security risk. And so you have to, as you're choosing whether or not to pass things on the query string, you have to question whether or not you want it to be able to be modified. The next question is unauthenticated support. So meaning simply not logged in. So if I go to this URL, I'm going to copy this same URL and open an incognito, I'm not logged in session, and go to the same URL, it works just fine. If you choose to pass things on query strings, it's going to be available to that page. And so there is support for it. And so if you need support for being able to work with people who are not logged into your system, then that's a good, or at least a possible choice. And one of our attendees today reminds that one of the benefits is that you can, so when you use query string parameters, it's something that allows you to share a link with people that pre-fill in the form. And it's also great for lead tracking and emails. There's definitely use cases for passing in query strings. You just have to consider whether you want things to be visible and whether modification can be a problem for you in the particular case that you're doing. So here we have good for passing secure data between pages, and I'm just going to copy and paste what Mark has done, just feel his work here. So another concern with the query string is that it has to be explicitly passed from page to page. So if we're on this page and we have a third page that's involved, if you want to continue to use Mark as a query string, that when that redirect action is formed, you also have to pass it. And that can be a little bit complex. If I designed some applications, for example, that have 4 or 5 or 10 forms, pages in a row, and if you have to explicitly pass it on the query string, you have to remember to do that as a developer, and then you have to consider every path. Maybe they're going A, B, C1, C2, C3, D. It has to be passed along, and so it can be a little bit tedious. Or if you add a new thing that needs to be passed along, you've got many places to go back and change just to make sure your information gets passed along. So that's a concern, something to think about, that it has to be explicitly passed by each redirect from page to page. So let's consider another one that's available to you, which is session. Session is an object that is provided in most website designs, and in Plantain App, we reveal it as a session token. So you can use a set session or some of these other variants of the session token that will allow you to create a session variable, and it is then stored by the system for a period of time. And you can retrieve it using these different tokens. And so let's see how that works. And then we'll talk about its properties. So we'll do another field here. Instead of passing things by query string, we're on go to the input side. We're still going to collect name, but now we're going to add a new button and pass it in a different way. So we'll go to our input form. I'm going to rearrange the layout just a little bit, make my buttons where they all line up here as we go along. Move that button around. But we have our test query string button, and now we'll add a test session button. And I'm just going to use the clone feature to start with a button and modify it. So we are going to use have one called test session, and the action that's related to it before we redirect to a portal page, we're going to use our create update tokens. There's lots of different ways that you can do this, but I'm choosing to do it with a create update token. And I'm going to put it before the redirect. And what we're going to do is to create a dummy value that is going to use the set session syntax. So again, I'm going to go to tokens and look up session. We can see all the different variations, but the one I want to use is set sessions, which stores a value in the server session. And this is the format of how to use it. So I'm going to copy that and go to our input form and paste it. So this is going to get evaluated when we create the variable called dummy. I called it dummy because we're not really needing to use it at this point. But because what we really want to do is just let set session work. So the session that we want to create is still called name. And the value that we want to set is the name field that's on this form. So it's going to get the value of name and put it into the session variable called name. So that once we do that, when in our redirect to the portal page, we no longer have to pass it here. We're just going to navigate to the display page and rely on the fact that it's there in the session. And so now we're going to have to change the way we get it out of the field, out of the session and display on the form. So our input form now looks something like this. We can have our name. So we type a name, and instead of using a query string, we'll use test session. It redirects. There's nothing visible on the URL. We haven't done anything to consume it yet, so let's do that. We'll also clone. So we'll clone this one, and this is going to be now called the session name. Just a way to get a name for this field so we understand what's going in there. And instead of initializing it from the URL, we're going to initialize it from session. And we can see in our definition of the session token that you use this as the format that you use. You just specify what variable you want to extract. So we'll use that, and the key that we want is name. We just say we want session name, and that's how it's going to be initialized. When we save it and go back to our display and refresh, we now have a new field called session name, and it has the value that was stored originally in session. It's not here. It exists in session. These two things are operating independently, and I hope that's not confusing to you. If we navigate away from this page and come back to it, it remains, because session exists for a long time, and we'll talk about that in the context of this particular user's interaction with your site. Versus if we do the query string test and we test that out, it exists here because it's on the URL, but if we navigate away and come back, it's no longer on the URL, so it's no longer here. So you're seeing that session is more persistent than query string, and it's automatically persistent. So let's talk about the properties a little bit. The durability of this is short term. It's a little bit, as we demonstrated, it's a little bit stickier than the query string one, but it's still short term. And there are things that can happen to make this go away. So one of them is that when you log out of, if you're a user and you log out, session gets reset and it goes away. Another is that session exists, it's a definition that exists on the server, and it can be set for a period of time. And by default, typically it's set for about 20 minutes. So if you don't take special steps to extend that, you could have a session variable and then it go to blank. And probably the most common scenario is that somebody starts working with your website and you stored things in session, and then they're doing that one day, they come back, the page is still up on their browser, and they start interacting with it again. That session variable is gone. The reset of session has happened. So while from their perspective, they're right where they were from the perspective of the website, session has been emptied, and so the order or the password or the whatever it is that you're counting on has gone to blank. And so that can be a little bit annoying. But in many, many cases, session and the durability of session is very useful. So onto our other properties. Is it visible? Well, no, it's not on the URL. They can't get to it. It only exists within the context of your processing. So for the most part, it's not visible. They can't see it, and they also can't change it unless your program specifically uses get set session or provides some other some other way to change it. And there are other ways, but it would be programmatically, not user modifiable. It's programmatically modifiable. So that's a little bit more secure. And it also exists unauthenticated. If we were to go to our URL in an incognito session, and we want to go to the input form, notice my incognito session doesn't have the value from my logged in session. You go incognito, you have a different connection, a different identification to the website. So it didn't carry my name forward.
And real quick, Dale, I just wanted to add in that that answers a question that Don just asked. And Don was asking if another person comes to the site, is it the same session or are there two session variables? And I just want to clarify that what you're showing here proves that there are two sessions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The session it's actually based on a unique cookie that is set behind the scenes, and we'll look at the cookies here in a minute. But the bottom line is your browser gets a unique identification to the server, and so your session is different from every other user's session. So if we test this incognito, we find that the session name now for this incognito session is there, and it will persist. And so you don't have to be logged in, and session will follow you along. And it's interesting. You can open up new tabs even, and since it's the same browser in the same with that same identification, you get the session follows you along. So it has a durability, and it exists. It's not just tied to a tab, and as a matter of fact, that's kind of can be a confusing thing that can cause a design problem when users open different tabs and certain things are following them around. I'm going to do that. I'm going to open up a new tab here and use the same URL, and you'll notice that the session follows me along. The session is connected to that browser cookie. And I've got another browser going here. I've got a Firefox one going as well. And if I am logged in as a different user, and if I go and hit the display page, we'll see that this is blank. It's different browsers. You're isolated. So different users, different browsers, you're isolated, and session doesn't follow you along. Okay. So in our kind of matrix of how things are, we just proved that there is support for unauthenticated users, not logged in users. And it's great for passing information between pages. You can you collect some information on one page, and you can go to the next page, or maybe several pages down. You don't have to work at passing it along because it remains in your session. So unlike query string, it just has durability for a period of time. And so very convenient to be able to move things along in a shorter session. But so now we get into the concerns. When you log out, session goes away. Also, session can expire, as I was talking about before. Maybe it's 20 minutes, maybe it's 3 hours. It's really dependent on the way the website was configured. But it can expire, and it will expire, and at some point that like in the overnight scenario, when the user comes back the next day, that can be an inconvenience. So we had the question about when a visitor sets his browser to not accept cookies, does that apply to cookies that store the session? I haven't explored that and explicitly done, but I think the answer is yes, that if a browser doesn't accept cookies, it doesn't accept cookies, and you're going to see that it would make it very hard for the user to log in. I believe the platform can be configured to force that instead of doing it as a cookie, it puts it on the query string, and it enforces then that there's some unique identifier on the query string. But in a practical sense, I haven't seen people do that to absolutely reject site cookies. I mean, I think this is something that I think this was a battle years ago, but I don't think it's being fought anymore. That sites having this unique identifier cookie is pretty much the norm. If someone knows otherwise, I'd love to answer that question. And we see another one. If your site sets two session variables 5 minutes apart, do they expire 5 minutes apart at the same time? Great question. So session variables expire that I know of in at two different times. When the session gets cleared, or when you log out. So in both of those cases, you're losing them at the same time. Cookies are different from that, and we'll get into that in just a second. So answer that live. Done. Okay. So let's go in and explore cookies. Cookies are the next one that very easy to work with and give you some slightly different properties. So to create them, you would use set cookie or one of the other variants, and to retrieve it, you use cookie or one of the other variants. So let's do that. So we have our input form. We're going to have a test cookie button. So we will clone test session and call it test cookie. And in the actions in our create, instead of using set session, we're going to use set cookie. So let's look up the syntax and be precise about it. So there is a set cookie, and there's some other variants here. So the one that we're going to do is set cookie, this one, set cookie equal to a value. There's the variations are one, you can set non-persistent to true, which will mean that as soon as they log out, they'll lose that cookie. And so that this kind of makes it act more like a session one, but it'll be, it will stick with them so long as they're on that site, I believe. I haven't tested that one explicitly. And then there's another variant that where you can say explicitly when you'd like it to expire. And I'll throw out a warning. I tried this yesterday and I couldn't get the syntax to work. So we may have a bug in this area, or it may be ignorance in this. And Matthew makes a good point, talking back on session for a minute, that session variables default to expire at 20 minutes of inactivity. And this can be changed in IIS in the setup of the site. And that is my understanding as well. So thanks for. So here's our syntax for set cookie. I'm going to copy that and go to our input form. And so now instead of using set session, we're going to be using set cookie. And it's pretty much the same syntax. We're going to say that we want cookie called name to be equal to the value of name from the form. And get rid of that part. So when this gets evaluated, it'll set a cookie for us. And then we're still doing a redirect to our display page, but not passing along any information on a query string. So this gets us there. Let's test that out. So we have refresh, and now we have a test cookie button. So circling back around in the disciples here. So we do test cookie. It redirects us. It's not visible. Cookies are inspectable. If you right click on the browser and take a look, in Chrome, it shows up on the application tab. There's a cookies tab, and it will show you all the cookies that you have. And so we have one here called name that has the value of Matthew we just created. We just haven't displayed it on the page yet. So let's get that done. We go to our input form. Instead of this, we'll clone session name, and it'll now be cookie name. And we're going to initialize. Again, we could look up the syntax, but it's cookie colon name is the syntax. And so when we now save that and refresh our display form, we can now see our cookie works. Notice the query string one is blank because we're not passing it up here. The session is hanging around, so we still have that. And then the cookie one is coming from here. So now, again, exploring a little deeper, the durability. The durability of this is it's variable, but it's also controllable. So when I say that, it's when a cookie gets created, if it is created as durable, it gets an expiration date. And so by default, this has been set up to expire next year on the 1st of August at a particular time. So this cookie is going to hang around for a long time. So it is really quite durable. And with those other variants of how to set a cookie, there's a way that you could say that you want it to last for 1 day or 30 days or 30 years. So you can do that and have it be very durable. If we go to, let's see, go back to our matrix, though, the question is it visible or accessible? Well, we've just proved that it is visible. So therefore, this information is accessible to a user if they know where to go look. They can look in the cookies of the site, and you can inspect any site that you go to, Google or your electric company, whatever, and you can see what cookies they have on the site. And so if this was some piece of secure information, it's probably not the best case to put it in a cookie. If it's useful information like an order number and you want it to last for as long as they're interacting with your site, then that's a pretty good place to put it. I keep going to the wrong tab here. But the next question is, can it be modified? Well, interestingly, yes, it can. The browser will give you the ability to put in a different value for this. And so when we refresh the page and it goes and gets the value out of the cookie, it takes whatever the current value is. And so users can impact based on coming into the cookies and changing it. So that could be a security implication and why you might want to use session for something which is not accessible to them, or some other method, something that's not accessible to the user. But if it's not a security implication, and oftentimes it's not, cookies certainly have their place. So in our list, so there's that. And then is there unauthenticated support? And the answer is yes. When you are not logged in, cookies will work. So if we do this and go into an incognito session, input, say, definitely veered away from apostles now, but we do our cookie name and it's there, and we can navigate from page to page. It's persistent. It works very well for a user that's not logged in. So what is this good for? Well, as we mentioned, it's good for passing insecure data from page to page. You can initialize filters or forms. It's a really good spot to store user preferences, right? So if somebody always wants to have their listing of orders sorted backwards by the last time it was modified, you could offer that as a option in your program. You can store it in a cookie, and then in your listing, you could retrieve it and say, order by field name descending. So really good for those kinds of things, just realizing that if the user switches from one browser to another, their preferences aren't going to follow them because their browser cookies are not set between browsers. So they'd have a different experience if they logged in on a different device. And then, on the concerns that because that can be modified and you can't particularly tell that they've been modified without taking special steps, then, that's of concern, something you should think about. And then, as I mentioned, it follows the browser. So that's kind of a feature, but it's also something to just think about. If the user signs in from a different device, their phone, for example, their choices that they've made on their desktop aren't going to follow them. Okay, so we had a question about how will this work? Save and resume links where the URL is encoded. I'm not sure I understand that question, David. So if you have follow-up, I'll be happy to tackle it. But you could, it would certainly be, I'm talking about the very simplest cases where we just put information on a query string, but it's possible to use some of our other tokens to encrypt things and put them on a query string. And so in our case where we put this away here, where we use the query string version, if we said ABC, if we took an intermediate step, instead of just putting it on the query string, we could have encoded this using, for example, our base 64 token or encryption token, and it would be it's a really a great, if I'm hitting your question, this is really a great, interesting case. If you need something to have the properties of a query string, but need it to be secure and untouchable, you could use encryption to get that done. So you encrypt ABC into something that only this form knows how to decrypt. The user can see it, but they don't see the actual value, and they can't change it because it's encrypted. So very good possibility. So long as you're passing around short pieces of information, and this is just generally true, short pieces of information lend themselves to query strings. If you have, I don't know what the upper limit is, but if you have a 1,000 characters that you're trying to pass on a query string, and then you encrypt it and encode it, and maybe it becomes 4,000, and at some point you're going to hit an upper limit where it's not useful. Great. I'm glad that mostly came in to answer your question, David. So thank you. Good. So
I was thinking also, Dale, with the save and resume part, that might be jumping ahead a little bit to the to your entity option in your matrix here.
Absolutely, and just look at the clock. We're not going to get to that. And actually, profile is going to be a quick one. I'm going to cover a profile just so that we hit the major four, and it's probably going to be a couple minutes past the hour. So hang with me if you can, and if not, then you can watch it in replay, because if you need to go to sleep, watching the Low Code Cafe, it's a good one to push you to sleep by. Anyway, so let's do that last one. So there is a feature within the platform that is called profile, and you can activate it under site settings, site behavior, user profiles, and there's a lot of information that's available on profile. And this really isn't, I will do it here, but I'm not really going to teach this, but we're going to create one called name, and I'm going to put it in the basic category, just on the research know in advance that this is there available to me. I am going to make it visible, and the visibility is going to be to all users. So that's a very quick setup. Oh, and then have to pick a data type, which is going to be text. There it is. And it's going to, oh, and I have to specify a length. So we'll say 30. So this has told the system to create a table or a spot in a table in the background that's going to take care of that, store that information. And if we, and again, I've made some changes to this particular system to make this easy to illustrate. But if we go to profile and preferences, there is an edit profile. And if we manage our profile and look at expected this to show up. Let's see if I'm going to force the server to refresh here to make sure that change has been accounted for, and then we'll go looking for it if I can't find it. So sorry for all clicking. Let's see if we can find it. See name. Well, I haven't successfully gotten it in here yet. So let's take a look. Site settings. There is name, visible. I think basic is the right thing. Oh, I don't need to do localization. And so these, I'm going to force this to refresh just to make sure it's not something silly. So prefix, for example, is one that's there. I'm going to do a little monkey see, monkey do here. And Matthew's trying to help me out. So let's see if that's the case. So we'll do site settings, user profile, name, basic. I don't think you do, but let's take a look at prefix here. How is prefix defined? Prefix as a category of basic, all users, text 50. So yes, sir.
I think Matthew's suggesting that you hit the next button, and that's yep, and then you have to define localization.
Okay, and I think when I was testing yesterday, I didn't, but that doesn't mean that y'all are so nice. You're trying to hang in with me and make sure that I get this right. And I'm going to try one more thing if this hasn't gotten it. Address. Make sure I haven't. So I did this out yesterday and I actually used name. So I'm going to just try one more time. And if we don't get it, we'll just go out on a note of failure. I'm going to add it as, I'm just going to call it name 2, which is going to be completely unique as a text field, going to be in the basic, has no default value, is not required, is visible, is user And since I, really not capable of going out on failure, I'm going to take over one of these other ones. I'm just going to use prefix. You'll have to excuse me that I'm doing that just to illustrate that this works. So we're going to, on our input form, we'll clone test cookie, and so we're going to say test profile. And the action, or create update, instead of saying set cookie, we look up and say profile. And so set profile has this form. It's very similar to the others. I'll just copy set profile. And so we're saying set profile to name to, and set it into prefix because we're just co-opting a field, which we shouldn't do, but we're putting name into prefix and then going on to our page. And so now when we look at our site, input, we have a test profile. And I'm going to put name here and say test profile. It does the work and goes on to the next page. If we now refresh our user profile, we can see that it's poked it into the prefix field. You can, if you do it right, you can create your own name the way that you want to. So from our display perspective, we can create a copy of this, and this is going to be the profile name. And it gets its value from profile prefix. So fresh, and it's pulling it. So going quickly over the properties, the durability of this is long-term. So long as you're logged in as a user, this site, it's going to remember that. So if you create a profile property and set it, you can, it's going to last forever. Whether or not it's visible is up to you. You saw in the settings that you say it is or is not. If you make it visible, you can also make it modifiable. So that's optional. But this is a pretty big one. This is not available in a unauthenticated context. If we were to go into the site and as a logged in user, go to input and say test profile, it's going to come in as blank because non-users don't have profiles, and so it's just going to be blank. So that's not useful. But so this is good for durable user-based settings. If you have something that you want to remember for a user, this is going to be really great. They log in, it's going to follow them from device to device because it's user-based. The concerns, the first concern was that it's a platform-based implementation. So you got to set up the platform right, and obviously I couldn't set up the platform right. And then it's not supported for, there's a special user called a host user or super user. If it doesn't work for them, so that's something you have to take into consideration. They have to be a normal user in your system. And then it has to, it does follow the user around. If they log in on a different device, they're going to get this setting. So that might be something that you like, and it might be something that you don't like. You just have to consider your application and go there. Okay, so we got through 4 out of 5. Hopefully that clears up what's good and what's the various properties of what's going on with the session state and why it's important for you to use it and to use it to get information around. Judging from the questions that we got, there was at least a few that thought this might be useful, something to clear up. I've been thinking about putting together a robust framework that will do this, and I have proof of concept for this, and so I'll have it developed by 2 weeks from now. And the idea is it's going to be we'll be a little bit more involved on the setup phase, but we'll provide the best of all worlds for you to choose from when trying to deal with session information. So we'll have a robust framework, maybe something that you'll be able to use in your applications or take something away from it that will be of value. But it's going to use entities, meaning data tables, and make use of other things like defining tokens, workflows, APIs that will help store this information and make it recallable. And really opens up some fun ways that these things can be used. So I hope you're here for that. In any case, glad that you spent the last hour with us, and we will do another one in 2 weeks. Happy low coding. Thanks.